I've been making YouTube videos fairly consistently now for over 2 years. It's been a wholly rewarding experience, particularly as my channel exploded in popularity over the last year to a level I never expected. I found many messages of support and made friends with people who I've looked up to for the longest time. Now, with a sudden surge in my status, it's only natural that I attract my own fair share of critics, and whilst that's certainly been the case with me, at the same time I've also been able to avoid YouTube drama, something common with most, if not all, channels that gain some sort of following. This is particularly surprising given the type of content I make, which is political in nature and heavily critical of an ideology coming from the so-called transgender community. Frankly, I'd rather avoid the mudslinging and sniping of YouTube drama as much as possible, as I'd rather focus my time and energy on content and issues that I find personally interesting. Times are changing though, and recently I've started to gain the attention of content creators who command a significantly larger audience than I do. As an example, Cat Black, one of the more influential trans creators on this platform, recently responded to a video I made on the subject of femboys. I found her response mostly respectful, if wildly off the mark, but I felt it was worth having a discussion on the points she raised, and as a result I made a video which I was particularly proud of. I know Kat is unpopular with a lot of political YouTubers, especially those on the right, but I commend her for having a dialogue with me. At the least, there was no ill will, at least from what I could see, no malice, and it wasn't like she misconstrued where I stand to an audience of hundreds upon thousands. Cut to last Sunday, and I received a message from a friend of mine asking to check out the latest video by ContraPoints. For those who don't know, ContraPoints, or Natalie Wynn, is considered to be one of the largest trans YouTubers on the platform, second only to Blair White in subscriber count. She's been regularly featured in mainstream news outlets, heralded as a philosopher and intellectual challenging the alt-right. Her content is mostly a combination of performance art with philosophy discussion hidden within. From a personal standpoint, her videos don't appeal to me. The focus on skits and thinly veiled caricatures combined with long running times really aren't my thing, but she does command a significant audience, closely reaching almost 900,000 subscribers at the time this video goes up. Now, I was initially confused as to why I was asked to check out Contra's latest video, entitled Cringe. In her feature-length video, Contra discusses the nature of morbid cringe, first focusing on examples of what she calls empathetic cringe and contemptuous cringe on American Idol, before diving into lolcow territory by referencing Christian West and Chandler. Roughly halfway through the video though, her focus changes to what she calls in-group cringe, and she makes the following statement.
And if you take a look around trans YouTube, a lot of the biggest creators on the platform have channels basically devoted to exactly this type of cringe reaction humilitainment.
So, who does she decide to focus on? Who are these large YouTubers that dedicate themselves to humilitainment? Well, there's Calvin Garra, Blair White, and, well...
By the way, you may want to check in on your understudy Rose of Dawn.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. In her 1 hour and 23 minute video, Contra talks at length about cringe from a seemingly neutral standpoint, but let's be clear, those 83 minutes of fabulous costumes and academic language are an excuse to do what she accuses myself, Blair, Calvin and others of doing, attacking trans people we don't like for our own personal gain. Due to the excessive length of Contra's video, I won't be addressing every point she raised, nor will I focus on ridiculous skits that would make even Doug Walker blush, but Contra misrepresented me and my channel to an audience of hundreds upon thousands, and it seems to be very telling why she did that. Before I go into detail on my issues with Contra, I want to clear up a few of the many misconceptions she made about my channel, as I'm aware this response video will no doubt attract some of her audience who are curious as to who Rose of Dawn is. Well, I started my channel in March of 2018, with a focus on discussing what I feel are issues from within the trans community. Contra acknowledged what is effectively my mission statement, but then strongly implied that my channel is instead focused on cringe content, highlighting the name of my weekly series, Trans Stupid, the Pillars of the Community video I made on Chris Chan, and my coverage of Jessica Yaniv, to paint me as someone who focuses on mockery rather than commentary. This, of course, is hugely disingenuous. The The stories I cover can vary from individual outbursts, media coverage, lawsuits, all the way to government policy. Simply pointing and laughing, which is what Contra heavily implies, is not what I do. And if discussion on these subjects is considered cringe to her, I would question why she doesn't point this critique at similar channels more aligned with her beliefs, as it's very telling that all three examples she provides only come from one particular outlook. Contra makes it very clear that she believes the highlighting of trans cringe is flat out wrong, but why does she feel so strongly about it? Well, it can be summed up in one word: cope. ContraPoints is someone who is a textbook definition of a gender radical. For those not familiar with this phrase, it can be summed up in the 5 following points. A gender radical is someone who believes there are many genders. Biological sex is a construct. Smash the binary. Don't assume someone's gender. And all of this is accompanied by left-wing politics. Now, Contra easily fits into each of these definitions. Of course, if she believes she doesn't, then I welcome her to openly distance herself from any one of these points, although she's no doubt aware of the consequences from her own fanbase. As a gender radical, ContraPoints supports ideas such as self-identification and is firmly opposed to medical gatekeeping. These are issues I've discussed extensively in other videos, and to go into detail here would detract from this video. But radical trans and gender politics can have terrible results, so how do you address it? Maybe reevaluate your beliefs and policies? Well, that requires too much work. Alternatively, let's shut down any debate and pretend it doesn't exist. This is a hallmark of authoritarian regimes throughout history, which is where the term political correctness originates. Where the socialist or communist policy failed, they couldn't acknowledge it. It wasn't politically correct. That's the true definition of the phrase, not, as it's widely assumed, to be nice, inclusive, and polite. Political correctness is about refusing to acknowledge reality and the undeniable results of a bad policy. My content, along with Blair, Calvin, and countless other trans content creators, highlight the flaws, failures, lies, and absurdities of radical gender politics. This is and always has been the core focus of my channel, and my content is much more difficult to dismiss than, say, a cis commentator talking about the same issues, because the label of transphobic bigot doesn't stick as easily on a trans person. Your average viewer might go along with it if you label Sargon of Akkad as a transphobe, but place it on a trans person like Blair immediately makes one question the assertion. Contra, on the other hand, avoids criticism of gender radical doctrine. The few times she's made comments questioning it have resulted in a harsh backlash, forcing her to step down. For example, her critique of the need to ask for pronouns at the end of August 2019 ended with her leaving Twitter after she was accused of prejudice against non-binary people. Contra has regularly been attacked by her own audience for airing a view that isn't quite kosher, and always issues an apology against the hate mob rallying against her. So what's the alternative if criticism is verboten? Well, she needs to cope. A cope is the action of dishonestly avoiding a debate you find yourself losing, which you know there to be valid concerns, but you want to conceal them anyway. An example of a modern cope is the narrative of the British Labour Party. Shortly after their recent election defeat, Labour's former leader, Jeremy Corbyn, proclaimed that Labour won the argument, and that the public was on their side. Now, judging from the results of that election, this is clearly untrue, as it was Labour's worst defeat since the 1930s. But the Labour Party and their supporters dismiss this by pointing to their engagement on social media, or they attempt to take credit for the steps the British government are currently taking in the coronavirus pandemic, which is an unprecedented national emergency. Raising these points only serves as a deflection from the failures they don't want to address. A cope can be broken down into 5 steps, as seen in this slide. Number 1. Try to ward off even discussing the issue in the first place. Number 2. Deny the issue exists, downplay its significance or scope, find ways to explain it away as nothing out of the ordinary. Number 3. Try to reverse the issue back on the person who raises it. This is a you problem. Number 4. Accept the issue exists, but then try to point out some other casual factor which minimises and normalises the issue. Number 5. Finally, when all else fails, resort to the complex and claim the issue is so irreducibly complex that we'll never understand it. So now we all know what a cope is, let's examine some of Contra's arguments and see whether she falls into any of the aforementioned categories. Number 1. Try to ward off even discussing the issue in the first place. Almost all of Contra's segments on me falls directly into this category, as she directly and purposefully misrepresents me. As I mentioned earlier, she dismissed the idea that my channel looks into meaningful trans politics by focusing on the amount of videos I made on Jessica Yaniv. She was also critical because I made a video on Chris Chan back in August last year, telling her audience I did so because Chris is a bad transgender.
There is a bad transgender in our midst. The bad transgender is not a real transgender like me. I'm getting pretty tired of this.
Anyone who watched it would know that this wasn't the purpose of the video, but rather an in-depth look at a notable and highly chronicled internet personality to determine whether or not Chris is actually trans. And despite the abundance of Chris Chan related online content, this was the first video, as far as I know, to approach the subject in a sensitive manner. As a side note, Contra's understanding of the Chris Chan phenomenon is weak at best. For example, she compared Gino Samuel, the creator of an entire series chronicling Chris's history, to A-Log, one of the notorious Chris Chan trolls. This lack of nuance resulted in some of Contra's fans targeting Gino's Patreon page, accusing him of being a cyberbully, which Gino responded to by pointing out that he regularly chats with Chris directly about the videos. On a more personal note, Contra misrepresents me again when she shows clips of me talking about transition and appearance before going on the attack. The context of these clips are completely lost in Contra's video. For example, the references to the seals in the transition video and the stream I had with Blair and Mars where I talked about appearance are not aimed at being shady to non-passers. Rather, I'm talking about the importance of not surrounding yourself in a hug box in your early transition and to be realistic in your appearance. That way, you can take honest steps to improve it. By misrepresenting me in this way, Contra was able to ward off actually acknowledging and discussing the problem in the first place, and this is a general reflection on her content, as she prefers not to discuss the negative results of her politics, as opposed to being honest and trying to fix them. Number 2. Deny the issues exist, downplay its significance or scope, find ways to explain it away as nothing out of the ordinary. Shortly before Contra starts her segment on me, she highlights Blair's video on trans predators. As you'd expect, Contra dismisses Blair's content as simply ways of making money, but take a look at this joke that she plays several times.
Vanessa made a few more videos about Yaniv, rebranding herself as a kind of transsexual Chris Hansen, exposing transgender predators wherever she could find them.
Trans predators, with a siren and flashing imagery. By doing this, Contra is knowingly explaining away and downplaying very real concerns that Blair has brought up in her videos. This is also reflected in Contra's dismissive comments on the amount of videos I've made covering Jessica Yaniv. She seems to make quite a bit of effort to be seen as condemning Yaniv in her video, so she's clearly aware of what he's being accused of, but by focusing on the number of videos, she seeks to downplay the significance of what Yaniv has done by painting it as obsessive. So I'd like to put a question to ContraPoints. What is the correct amount of times one should talk about a trans predator? When women are raped by a trans woman who is allowed into a women's jail, when a student officer with access to vulnerable people faces serious allegations of sexual misconduct, when a genital-obsessed racist can damage and end the careers of 12 immigrant women, how many videos is okay? The implication here is that the number of times to draw attention to a predator who is yet to face justice is 0, as to do so is to create cringe content. Number 3. This is a you problem. Of the 5 cope strategies, this is the one that is featured most prominently in Contra's video. Every allegation she makes against myself, Blair and Calvin can be thoroughly summarised as projection. So where do I begin? Well, let's start with appearance. I previously mentioned how Contra misconstrued some of my transition quotes, which is something she weirdly focused on in a synthwave clip, the purpose of which isn't entirely clear to me. However, sometimes I do point out appearances, and part of Contra's cope is making it look unreasonable and weird for people to point out extremely non-passing trans people, or people who deliberately make sure they don't pass. Or zero effort non-transitioning non-binaries. It is not unreasonable because it's relevant. It's not unreasonable to be concerned when someone very obviously male wants to enter a women's changing room or win a women's sports contest. These are the results of Contra's no gatekeeping policy, where a hairy, non-transitioning top is just as valid as any other woman. When Contra says everyone is valid, this is who you have to call she or be fired. So no, it's not a me thing or a mean thing to point out that having no standards results in these people being women and getting a place on women's shortlists. It's notable that Contra doesn't want you looking at the inevitable, currently happening results of an open border approach to trans politics. However, Contra does make some personal comments on my own appearance. For example, she brings up my logo as how I want to present myself.
Well, Rose, who prefers to represent herself with this cartoon. Okay.
This was an observation that was as interesting as it is incorrect. The logo in question was a piece of fan art that one of my viewers made for me. After sharing it with my followers online, as well as showing my friends outside the internet, it proved to be so popular that I just had to use it. Yes, it is flattering, but you can look at that picture and clearly recognise it as me. But this logo is not, and never has been, how I present myself. The vast majority of my content is filmed in front of a camera. This has always been a personal choice, as I wanted everyone to see the woman making the content in front of them. I wear minimal makeup, and the only filter I ever use is to fix the lighting in post-production, which is needed when one uses Vegas Pro, as the picture can be too dark otherwise. I also use a photo of myself as my channel's thumbnail on YouTube, my Patreon page, and Twitter. Me, as you see me, is how I present myself. And this jab at my appearance and how I see myself is fascinating coming from ContraPoints. She is most famous for her varied costumes, heavy makeup, lighting and filters, which she uses a variety of in every video she produces. In her latest cringe video, she has 3 different costumes, each with heavy makeup. There's nothing wrong with this, she has a distinctive style, but it becomes a problem when she accuses me of presenting my logo as how I want to be seen, whilst she in turn looks nothing in reality like she does in her videos. This is a clear projection here. Both Contra and myself have gone through facial feminization surgery. Despite the painful recovery, I've been thoroughly satisfied with the results I've achieved, and I've never felt better in my own appearance. Contra, on the other hand, has talked at length about how she hasn't been happy with hers.
I've been kind of depressed this past month, and I think part of it is that on a subconscious level, I think I was hoping that surgery would completely change my self-image and make me like myself. But it really hasn't. I mean, I'm happy with the results, I'd do it all again, but I still feel the way I felt before.
Now, I don't cake myself in makeup, filters and elaborate dresses to disguise how I actually look. I might not look perfect, I certainly have flaws, but I'm confident enough in my appearance that I don't disguise it. I cannot say the same about her, and this leads into a more significant projection Contra makes, which is how we feel internally about the presentation of trans people in the public eye, and a focus on self-hate. Contra alleges that Calvin Garrow projects his hatred of transgenders onto the public, implying he believes it is because of multi-gendered NBs that there is a dislike of trans people in society. She also accuses me and Blair,
Vanessa,
of presenting ourselves as the good trans, with Yaniv being the bad trans. All of this Contra clearly states as us projecting our insecurities onto the world, therefore being instantly dismissive of what our critiques actually are. This is an us problem, apparently. For clarity, no. Transgenders or Jessica Yaniv aren't the reason why people may have a problem with trans people in general, but this doesn't mean there's nothing worthwhile to critique here. In the case of a transgender, they push the narrative you don't need to have gender dysphoria in order to be trans. These are the same people who push for medical organisations to demedicalise transsexualism, unaware or simply not caring about the impact this would have on the trans people who require specific treatments for their dysphoria, such as hormones or surgeries. They are listened to by those in influential positions to our detriment, so it's right to critique them. Likewise, Yaniv isn't an excuse for someone to dislike all trans people or generalise that we're all similar to him. But the Yaniv case, and why I talk about it so much, is that it's the end result of narratives that people like ContraPoints push. The infamous ball waxing case is a perfect example of radical gender ideology taken to its logical conclusion. The only criteria to being a woman is simply to define as such. Sex is a construct after all, so Yaniv's genitals, to remain consistent with gender radical ideology, become female by definition. This was how Yaniv was able to raise the cases in the first place. Ultimately, creators like myself highlight people like Yaniv as they take advantage of narratives pushed by the likes of ContraPoints, using loopholes and self-ID policies for personal protection. Contra doesn't have an honest answer to any of this though. Instead, she accuses us of self-loathing. I've discussed the toxic narrative of self-loathing in the past. As a trans woman who is considered true scum, as someone who sits on the political right, such accusations come with the territory. I should make it clear that I started my transition back in 2010. Since then, I've had various medical procedures, including hormone replacement therapy, gender reassignment surgery, and facial feminization surgery. At this point, I consider myself fully transitioned. I feel no internal shame with who I am. And it's important to note by comparison, Contra is still fairly early in her transition, which only began in earnest around 2 years ago. Transition is a big deal, and it's understandable that someone still in the early days will be having mixed, even negative, feelings about the process. This isn't a defense for her dishonesty by projecting onto me, but it could be an explanation. But the accusations of self-loathing, the way Contra stresses we are abused and stigmatised by society, feel very much like she's projecting her own insecurities onto us as a way of explaining our positions. She's been very public with her own issues, even bringing them up in this very video. She openly mentions how cringing is a habit that makes her hate herself and projects this directly onto me. She talks about how all trans people are victims of harassment and hate. And yes, I'm sure the vast majority of trans people have indeed experienced some form of prejudice, but this doesn't mean our behaviours are controlled by it, or that we think less of ourselves as a result. It's a convenient tool to simply bat away any and all criticism we bring as being motivated by an internal disgust for ourselves. It gives the impression that there is one true way of thinking for a trans person, but based on her reaction, I'm not sure ContraPoints quite understands this. Number 4. Accept the issue exists, but then try to point to some other casual factor which minimises and normalises the issue. When discussing both Chris Chan and Yaniv, Contra brings up the issue of mental health. It's absolutely right to acknowledge Chris's autism, and in fact this is something many who follow him openly understands to give context to what he does. With Yaniv, however, it's a little less clear. Unlike Chris, Yaniv hasn't really discussed in public whether or not he has any diagnosed conditions. It may be the case that he does, but there could be other explanations for his behaviour. It could be a grift, or motivated by a fetish, or related to racism. But bringing up the casual factor of mental health doesn't take away the issues which Yaniv brings up. Yaniv was able to get people banned and censored because of the zero gatekeeping policies, and the radical trans policies that activists push into Twitter. Yaniv's mental issues may have made him take the path, but radical trans activists opened the door in the first place. As for the final cope, when all else fails, resort to the complex and claim the issue is so irreducibly complex we'll never understand it. Let's leave this as the placeholder. I've put forth criticism of Contra's politics having bad results, and that she avoids addressing them. Whilst I'm supposedly filled with self-hatred and appeasement for the right wing, I'm sure there are very, very complex reasons for Contra to ignore the problems brought forward by her beliefs. And I look forward to the 94-minute video explaining why we're bigots for not wanting this person as a women's representative. I've discussed the various cope mechanisms Contra raised in her video, but there's still more to discuss outside it, and it's quite relevant to the topic of her video, which is Morbid Curiosity. Now, Contra talks about what she perceives as a cringe obsession between myself and Jessica Yaniv, or Gino Samuel and Chris Chan. But right in plain sight is her own obsession with one particular online personality, who she still holds a grudge with to this day.
Vanessa.
Or Blair White. Let's use her actual name here. Since debating Blair back in 2017, Contra has had a notable dislike of Blair and her popularity, going so far as to create a thinly veiled parody of Blair known as Tiffany Tumbles. Contra denies that Tiffany is based on Blair, but the stark similarities haven't gone unnoticed.
The biggest clue for me that Tiffany was intended to be Blair is the way she repeatedly mentions that she isn't a victim.
Even though I'm trans, I refuse to be a victim.
I'm not a victim.
I'm not a victim. I am in complete control.
Contra's latest video ironically highlights her dislike for Blair even further. She repeatedly refers to Blair with the condescending nickname of Vanessa, or Vanessa LeBlanc, says she has inner beauty, unlike Blair, used a part of my transition video to snipe at her, makes a dig at Blair applying lip gloss, which is hypocritical considering the makeup Contra wears. She can't even talk about me without bringing up Blair first, and it's notable how Contra's eyes light up when talking about Blair as opposed to me. Of course, Contra also makes many spurious accusations against Blair in this video, the most serious of which is that Blair had no other motivation to make any content on Yaniv other than money, and not that Blair has concerns with what Yaniv has done. It's not that Yaniv is dangerous and radical trans politics enabled him, no, it's hatred, or internalized trans misogyny, or money grabbing, or bootlicking for Nazis, anything, just stop looking at our failures, I suppose. It's not just that Contra is using cope strategies to dismiss legitimate arguments, but she has expressed it through her grudge against Blair. She critiques the amount of content she deems not worth the attention, but she still returns to attack Blair and others over and over. Is this a way of making herself feel better, I wonder? Her video makes a clear argument that our motivation for content outside of money is simple: attack others and win over the right. But neither me nor Blair have made content to appease anybody. We make our content with our own political leanings, and that in turn attracts our audiences. There's no need for us to make apologies for comments we make, or, as Contra tries to put it, say we're the good ones. We don't have to win over the right. We just say our thoughts clearly, and this is reflected in both our audiences. I've had everything from socialists to anarcho-capitalists, non-binary to gender criticals watch my content, and whilst it's clear each of these groups have topics they strongly disagree with me on, there are also points they do agree with. I've never had to capitulate to gain my audience, and it's arrogant to assume that's the case. By comparison, Contra has found herself the victim of her own followers on multiple occasions for expressing the wrong views or appearing alongside problematic people, and has felt the need to apologise each time. In this instance, who is doing the appeasement? I never made my content to feel better about myself. I started my channel because I was tired of not seeing a narrative evolve from a community that claims to represent me in which I felt I had no say on. From far-left policies being pushed in the name of trans rights, to predators taking advantage of self-ID, the threats to freedom of expression, Contra is free to disagree with me on all three of those topics, but by pushing cope, she dilutes my own content to a significant audience and paints me as a harasser. Considering her recent cancelling episodes over the last year, I frankly expected better from her. Now before I end this video, I'd like to make one more point on the most condescending line from Contra's video.
Rose, are you okay?
Well, thanks for asking. Actually, no, I'm not okay, and you're right, but it's nothing to do with Jessica Yaniv or appeasing the right, as you might like to think. I actually experienced severe anxiety and distress, but I'm doing my best in this difficult period to get the mental health care I need, rather than misleading my audience to get a cheap takedown in a feature-length video. ContraPoints has an undeniably large channel, raking in a high amount of cash and fans, but despite this, she's still unhappy. Of course, success doesn't equal good mental health, but I take issue with her projecting her own unhappiness onto myself and others, and using this as a cheap shot about her content. I'm always honest about my thoughts and my content, but it appears Contra is hiding from her own audience, having to hide opinions in multiple characters, hiring someone to do her Twitter because her own fanboys can lash out at any given moment, and ignoring how the beliefs she holds can have worrying results. But hey, as Contra said in her video, maybe...
Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing matters. Nothing matters.